Great. So throughout the book, people are telling these stories and recounting trauma. Can you talk first about the responsibility you felt to do this work, and then second, how you built relationships with the people you interviewed?
Sure. I'll start with my responsibility. And again, I'm going to read a little bit from the afterword of the book where I address this. I've been asked why I do this work and if, as a white artist, I'm allowed to do it. My answer is that I do not believe those who have been systematically oppressed bear the sole responsibility for acknowledging that oppression. I am responsible for recognizing and naming the many forms of violence perpetrated by racist white people, Klan members, as well as government actors, those bent on oppressing Black people, those bent on upholding segregation, and those who are working against justice. So that tells you why I feel responsible. I mean, I just feel like I had questions about this history. I realized I stumbled upon kind of sites where I realized if a marker hadn't been there, I'd have no idea what happened there. I started to ask all these questions. What else has happened that I don't know about? And this journey, which is this book is really a journey, is how I answered that by researching, by going to sites, because I did feel responsible for calling this out and for both acknowledging it, but also the importance of naming what's happened and who it's happened to, and to pointing at and then working against injustice that happened then that we're still seeing today, even this week.
And can you talk about how you built relationships with the people?
Sure, thank you. Just repeated exposure, continuing to show up, building trust through relationship. I will not say that the minute I called people, they were like, sure, come on over. We were dying to talk to you. No. Just as any of us might feel vulnerable or many of them feel overexposed, for example. Many of them feel like people only show up when they're telling this one story and this isn't this long-term kind of engagement. So for me, I worked on this project for, easily 15 years. They wouldn't talk to me the first year, they'd maybe talk to me the third year. They wouldn't talk to me the third year, maybe they talked to me the fifth year or the seventh phone call, or I got to know someone else who then referred me over to them. So it really took that relationship building and trust building, which takes a lot of time and commitment, and you have to continue to show up.
So as I'm reading the book, I'm thinking, okay, this is the story I'm going to talk about during my discussion with Jessica. But then and then another. So it was hard for me to choose. They were all equally tragic. And so I'm wondering for you, was there a moment or an interview that stuck out to you during the process of collecting information for the book? And if so, can you tell us about that interaction?
Yeah, I mean, there were so many interactions, but a couple come to mind. I think in general, in work like this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Kimber, you have a history of working within communities, doing oral histories, your research is very community-based. But in these stories, I'm asking people to recount trauma. And you have to be careful with that. You have to intensely respect boundaries. You have to consider how you show up. You have to trust when they say it's enough or no. I drove once 10 hours to do an interview and she changed her mind. So I drove back 10 hours. The next day she said she was ready. So I drove back 10 hours. I mean, that's, you have to just fully respect that in this way that you're showing up as a listener and that you're trying to connect these histories, that it all has to happen really on their terms, because they're the ones who have experienced this trauma, both emotionally, mentally, and physically. And there's just a lot of respect for that. So a couple of things that stood out to me. One is Vernon Damer Jr., who it took me a long time to get to spend time with him. He's outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. His father, Vernon Damer, was murdered by Klansmen in response to all of his incredible efforts to register Black voters. And when first time I called him, his response to me is, "My story is not for sale. No, I will not talk to you." I thought that was really powerful and something that I had to remember. You have to kind of prove yourself. You have to have a reason why they might spend time with you. And after many years, I did get to spend the day with him. But that took a lot of proving myself. That took me building my experience. Another person that really stood out to me is Charles Moore. And I tell the story of him through an oral history and his father, Isaiah Moore, who was murdered in Louisiana. And Charles really felt like no one had been to talk to him before, and that his story had not been told, and that his father's story had not been integrated with the rest of these civil rights narratives. And for him, it was so powerful because I realized that part of the work was also, as he put it, bringing him closure, which is a word he used. And so both of these made me think about my relationship to my work in a different way, and my relationship to the people I was asking to tell their story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because, I've interviewed like Black women from my home community in Mississippi. They were all born in the 1930s, and they knew about what happened to Emmett Till, and nobody ever talked about it. So they just said that's just what happened back then, And when they did tell stories about, white violence, it was always when like a Black person was like a hero, like when they fought back and then like had to leave because they were the consequences. So.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Can I just do a plug then real quick while we're, I'm just going to plug, this can be like our intermission 1.5, Southern Cultures, which comes from UNC Center for the Study of the American South. I'm in it right now. This is the summer issue with the incredible Amy Sherald on the cover, edited by Tika Selman, who is one of your local incredible people who curated it. And Kimber, I'm sorry I don't have the issue, I only have the copy. Her essay Makeshifting is in the spring 2020 Southern Cultures. So I'm just going to plug that for a minute if you want to hear more about what Kimber was just talking about. It's an incredible amount of research. It's really compelling. It's called Makeshifting. So check out Southern Cultures. Okay, now we can keep going.
Thank you. Yeah, shout out to Southern Cultures. Big fan of Southern Cultures.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about aesthetics. So you make some really creative and significant aesthetic decisions throughout the book. So for instance, I'm reading this story about a 23-year-old Black man named Mac Charles Parker, who was arrested for allegedly kidnapping and raping a pregnant white woman. So he takes this polygraph test. The results are inconclusive and they're never released. And then Mac Parker is moved from one jail to another. And then one night he's forcibly removed from his jail cell. And a week later, his body is found in the Pearl River in Mississippi. And so I read this story, but then I flip the page and I see these pictures of just seemingly ordinary landscapes. So I read a bad story, I get this photograph, and the photograph for me felt like a moment of relief. So can you talk about some of those aesthetic decisions that you made and how and why you made them?
Sure. I mean, part of it is just thinking about how the landscape can swallow these stories up, especially the Southern landscape and the fecundity of it. It can just take over a site. And that, I think, is a metaphor for the ways that we lose sight of our history, that we forget. And there's such a kind of role for artists and creatives and scholars in the work of remembering. So this is the image that you're talking about. Well, first I'll just start here. This is an image of Charles Henry holding a picture of his father, Isaiah. And then this is the former jail cell for Black prisoners where Mac Charles Parker was held. You get to the narrative about his murder, his lynching, and then you get to this landscape, which is in Liberty, Mississippi, where Lewis Allen and Herbert Lee's murders took place, or the stories began there. And I think I thought a lot about rhythm. I thought a lot about how you keep your viewer. And so moments where they need a visual break. I also thought a lot about the banality of the landscape, and especially the kind of Southern vernacular photography that we see a lot that's kind of romanticizing this kind of, decay. But I mean, the reason I took these images as these kind of barren landscapes was to highlight the absence that is there. Often it's the absence of the history, the absence of a marker memorial, the absence of justice, just to really kind of show that these are places you could drive by, yet they are sites of incredible significance, both for our nation and for communities and for individuals.
Right. Did you want to go through some more?
Sure, I can go through a little bit more. One thing that you see that kind of references the archive is the white text on the Black page. Thank you, UNC Press, for letting me have all these Black pages. And part of that's referencing microfiche, which was how I learned so much about these cases. This kind of 2-column is thinking about newspaper columns and those headlines. I thought a lot about inversions in this book. So both the white on Black, but also the way that I inverted the telling of these stories. Often in newspaper articles, the focus was on the white racist killer being acquitted, instead of what happened to the Black civil rights activists, or the Black man walking down the road, or the Black woman who was attacked. So I really wanted to flip that around to really focus on the resistance, the activism, and what was perpetrated, not on the kind of injustice of often, white confessed killers being acquitted. But I can just, this is where Clinton Melton was murdered in Drew, Mississippi. And then you get to these pages, which are the story. And then this is the oral history with Dolores Melton Gresham, Clinton Melton's daughter. And this is such a beautiful oral history. She's incredible. She talks so much about, and you'll see this in a lot of it, like in the absence of justice, how do you move forward? How do you move towards maybe some form of forgiveness? How do you keep really functioning? You then go into all these pages of a petition that was written to the FBI by residents, and you can see at the top that they want to have the death of Willie Henry Lee looked into, and just the bravery of signing your name and your county at a time like that when so many people were being disappeared, and when the violence was systematic, right? Like the murderers were getting away with it. They were allowed to act again, and so anyone involved in activism knew 100% what their risk was, and they did it anyway. And that kind of courage is unbelievable.
Absolutely.
It's not unbelievable. It's believable because they did it and it's incredible. But I try to imagine myself in that situation. If I know how likely it is and that no one's going to come down and like shine a camera on what's happening to me, that I could just be disappeared, how to keep moving.
Right. You also use archives in really fascinating ways. We kind of got a glimpse of what's included, but in addition to photographs, you also pair these narratives of racial violence with, handwritten letters from family members, hand-drawn maps, newspaper clippings, poetry, obituaries. So I'm thinking about the story of Ben Chester White, the 66-year-old sharecropper who was approached by 3 Klansmen at work, and they asked him for help in finding a lost dog. And so the Klansmen then drive Ben Chester White into the Homochetto National Forest outside of Brookhaven, Mississippi, where they shoot him repeatedly in the backseat of a car and then dump his body into a creek. And it was said that the Klansmen allegedly murder Ben Chester White to lure Martin Luther King Jr. to Natchez, Mississippi. And then on the next page, you see this handwritten letter from Ben Chester White's son. And he writes that the last words of Ben Chester White described by, and he crosses out the word Klansman, and he writes, killers, was, Lord, what have I done to deserve this? And so you see this archive speaking for these people, Black people, when they can't anymore. So what do you think? What is the work that archives are doing here?
I mean, I think you just said it. They're speaking, right? And it's also like there's a public archive and there's a private archive. And I think they operate in different ways. I think the newspapers and the way that the public understood what was happening, which were often influenced by racism and racist editors and community pressure, perhaps. But then you've got these private archives. You've got, this was a letter that was sent to the Southern Poverty Law Center, who were so supportive of my research. When the Southern Poverty Law Center was investigating and starting to kind of gather information about what had happened. You can see here, this is the site where Frank Morris's shoe shop was in Faraday, Louisiana. Frank Morris was murdered when Klansmen set his shoe shop on fire and burned him alive inside. This is a hand-drawn map that talks about where it is in town. You can kind of see like you're facing the right way. And then you have this letter that Stanley Nelson, who's an investigative reporter at the Concordia Sentinel in Faraday, Louisiana, carries in his pocket because it's from a woman who is talking about how she and her husband are really changing because of these articles. And she says, thank you for what you were doing. If all the wicked hate crimes could be taken out of the secret places, and she underlines secret, and stand in the light, this country could be healed. And he keeps that because it motivates him to keep going. But other pieces of archive that are indeed very personal are like obituaries. This is the obituary of Virgil Ware, who was murdered on the same day the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed outside of Birmingham, Alabama. And this is the obituary of Vernon Damer. And I often say that a sentence of his obituary runs through this book like a road. And the last sentence of it is, his sacrifice on the altar of freedom should inspire us to finish the task. And Tom Rankin, actually, who is also a scholar and artist in the Bay Area, in the Bay Area, in the Chapel Hill, COVID brain, in the Chapel Hill, Durham area, made a wonderful comment once when I spoke, and he talked about this insider language that gets included on things like obituaries. And I keep thinking about that versus the more kind of outsider language that might be on a historical marker, or that might be somewhere else, that you get to experience this kind of insider language on these private archival materials. And I really do mean for them to be part of the storytelling mechanism of the book.
That's funny. Insider language about obituaries. I have this joke with my mom. This is a little bit off the subject, but when people are married, people are dating for a long time and they don't get married in like Black communities, they're listed on the obituary as like his special friend. So
right, insider language, right? Totally.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, what was your experience like finding and gathering these documents, and how did you decide like what to include?
Whew. So finding things sometimes is easy and sometimes it's impossible. Often I would just drive to the county seat wherever something happened. I would go to libraries and look through microfiche. Occasionally I would find a librarian in some of these places that actually kept their own archives of things. So it really, really varied. And then other times, it really varied. And often with journalists and with family members, we would each bring our files out, we'd open them up, and we would kind of clear our files with each other. So if I had something that a family member had never seen before, they would want to copy it, or a journalist hadn't found that I had found, they would want to copy it, and vice versa. So there's a lot of kind of archive sharing. I do think one thing that is very concerning to me, and I hope will be the concern of a lot of people, is the care of these archives, the preservation of these archives. Archives are political, right? And so there are moments when the archive is not considered important and it's not cared for. And then it becomes back into importance. And then there's a lot of corrective work that's done to that archive, or often it's sealed off because it's in such bad shape. And so really thinking about ways that we archive and protect the archive as, this kind of evidence and ephemera of our history. It's in varied states of care or decay. And yeah.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about just the South. So you take us to these ordinary landscapes where these acts of extraordinary violence often took place. What is the value of looking at the ordinary or the everyday when thinking or writing about the American South?
Well, I mean, honestly, the way I experience the American South, of having been raised here and living here now, is through the everyday, right? And I think so many of these stories are really extraordinary, but I think the way that we move through the landscape is about the everyday. This is also about markers and memorials, right? Like it's a field, it's a parking lot, it's a rundown store, it's a concrete slab with flowers growing on it. So I do think there is a kind of, like I said before, like this everyday landscape quality to the work. But I also think it's important to remember that this American South is not a monolith, right? And to talk about it in monolithic terms is to do no service. I think we need to talk about it with nuance. I think we need to really dig deep and clarify some of these mythologies, because I don't think that they do justice to these stories or these individuals. And so for me, I wanted the viewer to feel like these are places they could pass by. I wanted to hopefully inspire their curiosity to find out what's happened around them. I mean, you look at what EJI is doing now with their memorial program, at looking what's happened in each county, and in empowering citizens to work together in a coalition to bring a marker to kind of change what might be an everyday landscape to more kind of memorial ground.
Mm-hmm. Right. Just a quick reminder to the audience, please submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you have questions. But yeah, that's interesting, Jessica. I was thinking when I was reading the book that it would be so cool to have like some kind of app um, that was connected to like Google Maps that could take you through all of these sites and like narrate it because,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea, and I've thought a lot about it. And early on, especially, many people were like, "Why don't you just put up the memorials? Why don't you put up, signs where people can link and hear?" And then very quickly, I realized, really through the storytelling of Worlis Jackson's daughter. Worlis Jackson was murdered in Natchez, Mississippi, and his daughter Denise Jackson Ford wanted there to be a marker for a very long time, and the city would never do it. And then the city said that they were going to do it, and then they had no funding for it, and it really broke her heart. And so she wrote an article in the newspaper about it, and the community, there was just an outpouring of support, but also money to get it put up. And that for her was so important, that the community did it for her in acknowledgement of what had happened in memory of her father, that I just started to realize, like, this is actually not for me to do, right? Because there's important community processes that take place in the memorialization of things that often take a very long time, but part of that process, brings healing, brings closure. Stanley Dearman talks about that in Philadelphia, Mississippi, in the book about the civil rights summer murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, about how long this triracial coalition took to get the marker up. But one thing they felt like they had to do first was call for the case to be reopened. And by calling for the case to be reopened, the killer was arrested and tried and imprisoned. And so those kind of processes become so important and elaborate, and there's such a need for that to be community driven, that I really kind of backed away from this idea of me putting up some kind of memorial. I think, now that the book is done, the idea of being able to travel around and hear the voices or see some of the ephemera, yes, that is very exciting to me. But I'm trying to be careful about the way that I intervene in these community processes, especially not being from the places where this is happening.
Yeah. And in Mississippi, especially, the markers themselves become sites of racist violence, like some of those Emmett Till signs that are.
Yes, these markers are not benign. They are malleable. Like Emmett Till's has literally been removed by people who want to, and doing that is another act of trying to erase. People are really committed to erasing history. And so it's, our jobs to keep it front and center. And again, like I say, this idea of doing the work of remembering.
Right. So for those of us working in and on all types of projects related to the American South, especially the Deep South, we often struggle with like the duality of this place. It's beautiful and it's home, but it's also the site of some really horrific things. And so in my own work, I try to balance narratives about white terrorism or violence when I write about it, with narratives about, Black creativity.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned earlier that Road Through Midnight aims to reframe these commonplace landscapes as sites of both remembrance and resistance. So in what ways is Road Through Midnight a work or an act of resistance?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Again, like going back to this idea that, like, as you say, the South is not monolithic. There's a balance of both incredible creativity in the Black community that you focus your research on. And yes, this, horrific prevalence of white racist violence. And I think, yes, I think kind of balancing that is so important. Connecting the past to the present, I think, is really important. And when you asked me that question, like, how is it an act of resistance? It really made me think of Myrlie Evers Williams and something that she wrote when Medgar Evers' killer was convicted. I'm just going to read it because I feel like she really can locate us here in this moment and inspire us to do the work. So she said this at the Crimes of the Civil Rights Conference in April of 2007. She says, "You could hear the footsteps. We were seated and the guilty verdict was read. I can honestly say that every bit of anger, every bit of hatred, of fear escaped from every pore of my body. And when that verdict was read, and I felt free. But I also felt that America, my people, all people were freer when that verdict was read. Reporters from around the world asked questions. How do you feel? They asked. All I could say was, Medgar, I kept my promise. It took 30 plus years, but I kept my promise. Hopefully others will also benefit from that promise as well. The fear, the anger, and the willingness to live a full life, all of those things were coming together, and I felt I have done my job. I kept my promise to Medgar, but my job was not finished because more needed to be done. As we meet here, and I always think she's just talking to us, whatever group we're in, as we meet here and talk about how to go about it, I have another concern. How do we who have been there and are dying off now, how do we, those who are the generations behind me and behind them, transfer the dedication, the knowledge, the appreciation of all that has gone on before to a generation now where so many see it as something long ago that does not impact them at all? We not only have to remember the past, we also have to make the link to the next generation coming along. If we don't, we will find ourselves in another kind of civil war, another kind of horror that we will not know how to take care of. As someone said, community is so important. And she goes on to say, because of the verdict that put Byron de Lebecq, Medgar Evers' killer, in prison, she finishes by saying, a promise was made, a promise was kept. And I think this idea of passing on knowledge, I think this idea of working against this kind of another kind of civil war that she describes, which is getting really close to some of how I feel about where we are right now as a country. I think that is an act of resistance. I think working against that, I think working towards justice. I want everyone to start with knowledge. But then you have to act, right? So knowledge is a great foundation, but then you have to have action. You have to demand justice. You have to dismantle white supremacist systems. I think about what Cornel West says, that justice is what love looks like in public. And that to me is what Myrlie Evers is talking about. And I feel like by weaving together all of these stories, I'm trying to be part of that call for justice, that understanding of how we got here today, and that there are, a lot has changed and a lot has not changed. Enough has not changed. And yeah, be part of that call for justice.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about symbols before we take some questions from
Okay.
So the title of the book is Road Through Midnight. And as I was making my way through it, I was thinking about the significance of like the midnight in Black culture and in Black folklore. I can remember going to like a Black Baptist church and the preacher being like, late in the midnight hour, God is going to turn it around. Or listening to this Wilson Pickett song. It's a blues song that we would listen to at my aunt's house called In the Midnight Hour. And he's like, I'm going to wait till the midnight hour. That's when my love comes tumbling down. I mean, I can only imagine what he's talking about, but it seems like you do things in the midnight hour that you wouldn't necessarily do in the daylight, right? Yeah. So the word midnight also like appears often throughout the book. So you have photos from Midnight, Mississippi, but it was just after midnight when Medgar Evers was killed.
Yeah.
Around midnight when a deputy sheriff gave the keys to a jail to a hooded lynch mob who forced, Mac Charles Parker from his cell. So what, if anything, is symbolic about the midnight?
Well, there's so much that's symbolic, right? Like you can say the word and we conjure something in our head, even if it's just this idea of darkness. And it's also this kind of transition point as we transition into a new day, as we transition towards kind of dawn coming. And I thought a lot about that, both in the aesthetic choices, the thing about moving through the landscape, the sun kind of sets in the middle and it rises again to a new day. And so part of it is both dark and both the activism that can happen in the hours of midnight and during the night, kind of behind closed doors, but also the violence that occurred during that time. Midnight's also kind of, I feel like, about something that you can't see and that you can't quite distinguish what's happening. But midnight, I mean, really for me, midnight was really wanting to just call out that place, because going to Midnight, Mississippi is one of the first places I went to research the murder of Rainey Poole. And I saw these two young boys, black boys, playing with their bicycles in the middle of the street. And arriving at a place that's that small where a person was disappeared through violence just made me think about looking at these bodies in the landscape and thinking about both the vulnerability of those bodies and the absence of kind of a culture of justice. Um, and and yeah, this idea of passing through a place like that, you can pass through it in a minute and not know what happened there.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe Midnight, Mississippi for folks who've never been there?
Yes. Okay. Well, so remind me, we were just talking about this highway the other day. What highway is it off of
I
in the
mean,
Delta?
49 or 61, but it's
Right. So you just kind of take this V and head to the left and you get into Midnight. And one thing you see in the book, and before you even get to the title page, I kind of take you through Midnight. And, I show you the bank of the Sunflower River, and I take you through the story of Rainey Poole. But then this is the image of the young boys in the landscape. This is literally the road through Midnight. And there's this hand-drawn sign with moons and stars, welcome to Midnight, which I feel like talks a lot about scale of place. And so it's a small dot on the map. And so thinking about how violence that was systematic worked in a place like that, where if you disappeared someone, the reverberations were felt widely. It didn't happen without people noticing. So yeah.
right. And so the subtitle of the book is a civil rights memorial. And so across the nation, people are having these conversations about monuments and memorials and about where memorials exist and where they don't and shouldn't. So what are your thoughts about how Road Through Midnight could influence the conversations people are having about monuments?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I show a lot of different kinds of memorials in the book that are, again, this public versus private. There's some individual memorials that people have put up that have photographs on them that feel really intimate. And then there's others that cities have put up that have the language of a memorial, which sometimes can leave something to be desired in terms of understanding the emotional impact of what happened. I really want people to think about how we tell histories and how we remember and how we activate the public. I think that is incredibly important. And I think that we also have to realize how important the gesture of a monument or memorial is. And that starts with understanding the racist strategies that were at play when many of these Confederate monuments were put up, and then understanding potentially how restorative it can be to rip it down, and then how impactful it can be to put up memorials for other people, to remember other activists, to remember Black activists, Black scholars, to take down, I mean, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. Nathaniel Bedford Forrest is on the side of I-65. There's a bust of Nathaniel Bedford Forrest in the state capitol. Why would we do that? He was a horrifically violent Klansman. And it speaks volumes. It is like a wolf whistle of racism every time one of those things gets put up. And I think that is what we have to work against. We have to work against racism in all of its forms. And we especially have to work against dismantling the systems, especially the public systems that are racist, and these monuments in the process of putting them up or leaving them up is part of that needs to be dismantled. I don't know if that answers your question. I kind of went on a...
Yeah. Right. So last question before we take some questions from the audience. What do you hope readers will take away from your book?
I hope they'll ask a lot of questions. I hope they'll educate themselves. And, especially to my white readers, like, don't ask Black people to explain all this history to you or explain all of these kind of, the kind of impact of all this to you. Do research. There's stories out there. You can answer some of your own questions. If your children are not learning about these things in school, then let that be part of your anti-racism work. You know, and again, like I said before, like the knowledge is great, the empowering yourself is great, the self-reflection. I hope this leads to all of that. I hope this leads people to ask questions about the history of where they live. And then I hope it causes them to act. I hope it causes them to think about, oh my God, some of these stories sound like what's happening this week, or some of these stories sound like what happened last week. Some of these stories sound like Breonna Taylor. Some of these stories sound like Jacob Blake. You know, some of these stories sound like Trayvon Martin. And so what are we going to do about it? And so I hope that all this knowledge and understanding these through lines of our history lead to action and lead to working towards justice. And like I already said, dismantling these racist systems. And that's through local elections, that's through just through voting, but that's also through our institutions and looking at our institutions and how this is at play. So I hope, yeah, I hope it just inspires more knowledge, but also action. And I think you can't read a book like this or even really study the civil rights era without them looking directly at not only our criminal justice system and our prisons, but also our education system. And so I hope that that's something that maybe after they get immersed in this history that they think, let me start getting interested in criminal justice and incarceration and in education and what's happening there.
Right. Great. So you ready for some questions from the audience?
Sure. Before we do that, I just have one more shout out. So my editor at Center for Documentary Studies, which is also in your neck of the woods, Alexa Dilworth, was such an incredible partner on this, and it's her birthday today. And so I would just have to say to everyone, happy birthday, Alexa. Thank you so much. Sorry, I just had to do a shout out. I'm done.
Okay. Question. Are some of the victims regular Black folk who were killed just for being successful and demonstrating humanity, or are the victims all civil rights leaders?
Both. There are victims who were active in civil rights era organizing and resistance, and there were individuals who were murdered because they were Black and because they were part of a systematic effort to spread fear and disempowerment through communities, especially around voting, because white racist people were afraid of the Black vote and Black empowerment. Mm-hmm. There's also a story about Viola Luozo, who was a white woman who came down after Martin Luther King kind of made a call for people to come for the Selma March, and she drove protesters back and forth, and she was murdered. And so there's also stories like that.
Yeah. I think about the Charles Moore and Henry Hezekiah D.
Yes.
I don't know which one it was, but they say he was tall and handsome, and he had, I think they were calling it a conch, but it was like a perm, and yep. He had to keep his head tied up because that's how you preserve the style. But he was killed. People thought he was a Muslim.
Yeah, because he had a head wrap to preserve his hairstyle. Yeah.
Yeah. How has this book been received by the families whose stories you share?
It's been received really well. It's been really meaningful. You know, I stayed in touch. I frequently check in. I take a week or two road trip and go see everyone. After the oral histories were edited for clarity, I drove and saw everyone and asked them to read them and let me know if there was anything that they were uncomfortable with, that didn't seem like it was communicated correctly, or anything they wanted to add. And so you're just talking about Charles Eddie Moore and Henry Hezekiah D. Well, Charles Eddie Moore's brother, Thomas Moore, really wanted to add quite a bit. And so you'll see there's 2 dates on that oral history, the date I first took it and the date we kind of discussed it some more. And then, you know, like I said, Charles Henry really feels like this book brought closure. A lot of the family members and journalists even are happy to see these stories. Often as a family, you're really immersed in your story. As a journalist, you're immersed in the stories that you're reporting or investigating. And they really appreciate seeing this as this larger narrative happening throughout the region. And then, you know, Denise Jackson Ford. So I took the oral histories to them, but also when the book came out, I took it to them first. I wanted them to see it before it went public. And that was really moving. That was very moving. And Denise Jackson Ford, Worless Jackson's daughter, we were both sitting there crying, and she just kept saying, "You done good, you done good." And that to me, it felt like such a heavy and intense responsibility to these stories and to these individuals. And so for them to feel good about it meant the world.
Can you talk about your photographic process? Do you shoot film or digital? What camera, and do you print it?
I shoot digital now. I shot all of this with the Mamiya 7 II on film, and I was printing C prints for like half the exhibition, and then I switched to digital archival inkjet prints. So my process has evolved. The audio was collected on a Sony audio recorder and edited using the I'm just going to go all process here. Edited with the software Trent, which is a great audio software, transcription software. And then I also worked with a producer, Mike Murillo, who's in the Bay Area, to produce the oral histories with sound for exhibition. And so that was a lot of fun too, to think about bringing all of that kind of to life.
What is your next project?
Oh Lord, if you'd asked me that before the pandemic. Well, I've worked on that. I worked on this project for a long time, and projects kind of have different stages of ending. And so maybe I was done photographing, but then I went back and did all the oral histories. And then while I was writing the oral histories, I'm having exhibitions, and I start to put the book together. And by the time you put the book together, it's been a while since you've kind of maybe showed up at your first site. So I've done some projects in Southern Georgia with the support of Columbus State University, where I was a fellow. So I've done 2 projects there. One is called Love Rich Land, which is really thinking about beauty and resistance in that area. And a lot of portraiture, some landscapes. I really was missing portraiture. I also felt like I was really kind of tried to be invisible sometimes working on this project. And I wanted to get back into like, hi, see me, I want to talk to you, let's have a conversation. And not, conversations in the public during the Civil Rights Project were sometimes, you weren't sure what you're going to get. And so it's kind of fun to do something that's really about beauty and style and how those kind of acts of agency, individual agency and expression are also acts of resistance. And then I worked on a project called We Are Carver, which is about a JROTC program at George Washington Carver High School in Columbus, Georgia, which is very close to Fort Benning, really thinking about the idea of military and education and the students' ideas about freedom and their future. And so that's a lot of portraits and both thinking about them in uniform, which is sort of this, unifying thing, and also the way that they express themselves out of uniform. And then there's a lot of audio in that project as well. Mm-hmm. And then now, I don't know, COVID has I don't know how many artists are listening to this, but it's made me question and rethink a lot. And so I'd have a hard time. I'm working on things, I'm tinkering with things, I'm making, but yeah, this is a real time for me to think and reflect about my role as an artist.
Right. How do we reconcile the false memorialization of Southern history and the racism woven into that narrative with the memorials that need to be created and shared?
Well, tear them down. Tear the false racist ones down. Support. I mean, I have to say, I find it incredibly cathartic to see a group of people tear a racist down off a pedestal and just leave the horse or just leave the pedestal. I think that's a really powerful public gesture, and remove them and put up new ones and go through the community process of doing that.
Have you returned to Midnight with the book? And if so, how has it been received?
I have returned to Midnight, but I've not gotten out and gone knocked on the door and shown people my book. No. But I drove through Midnight even. I took the book back in January and February to everyone in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And Yeah, I drove through midnight, but I did not spread the book around. I still get nervous to be like, hey, and I don't have any personal connections to individuals there. So
We have a comment from Bill Ferris. Thank you both for your eloquent voice to inspire us as we face racism in our nation today. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill, for your work.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So comment, thanks for your work, but question, I'd always thought what would Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children might look like if it had illustrations, and also that much of that text pieces find almost an echo in your pages. Does any of this give you a sense that there is a timeless element to this part of the South?
I'm careful with the word timeless because I don't, because I think sometimes, I'm skeptical maybe of nostalgia around parts of the American South, especially some problematic ones. And I'm really conscious of disrupting some of the mythologies and working against some of the mythologies of the American South. So, but sure, yeah. I mean, I think there are landscapes that feel really Southern, and so maybe that is a timeless quality. But I really think there's some urgency to all of this, and so my concern about timeless is that it's almost passive, like you just get to observe it and it feels familiar to you, and so you can just accept it. And I really want, maybe it's just me, my rage, my 2020 rage talking here, but like I really want like the urgency to be felt. And I think sometimes when we live in these mythologies of the American South or the timeless quality of the American South, we lose some of that urgency.
And final question, did you work with Jerry Mitchell, the journalist in Mississippi?
I did. And if you guys listening, Jerry Mitchell has a new book out and it's really fantastic. Our books came out around the same time. In January, we met in Jackson and traded our books, and then COVID hit and our book tours were canceled. But Jerry's incredible. He was at the, now I'm forgetting the name of the newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi. He was there for a long time. He's an investigative reporter. He is sly and smart and funny and a great storyteller. And he was able to get, for example, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission files, which had been sealed, leaked to him so that he could release them. If you don't know what the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission was, a state-run segregationist spy agency that worked against civil rights in the state. And yes, so I got to work with him. There's an oral history from him in the book. And yes, I saw him just in January, and he's incredible. He worked to bring many killers to justice. A Clarion Ledger, thank you. Thank you, my sister Jen, for texting me. It's a Clarion Ledger.
Yeah. Great.
So now he's actually at Millsaps running an educational program for justice around cold cases. And he's working, he's kind of working in the civil rights movement, but also outside of. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I think I told you when we first talked, it was so interesting how, the names were familiar, like the attorney R.J. Brown on the Mac. Yes. His son was my elementary school teacher, and a lot of those murders happened near Alcorn State University, which is.
Well, you went to Alcorn State. Medgar Evers went to Alcorn State. Charles Eddie Moore was at Alcorn State when he was murdered, and one of the ways they identified him was from his key, his like dorm room key. Yeah. And yes, R.J. Brown, first Black attorney in Mississippi, was really influential in so many cases, but in Mac Charles Parker's case, I found it so compelling reading or researching, which was hard with Mac Charles Parker. There's not a lot of information, but learning about his strategies and how he was working against all these attempts to prevent justice there.
Awesome. So I think this is a great time to wrap up. Yeah. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Maria for closing remarks, but thank you so much, Jessica, for this.
Yeah, thank you, Kimber. And it's been such a part of this event has been such a joy because I've gotten to talk to you and hear about your research, which I think is so important and powerful. So I hope everyone will check it out. Also, just quickly, thank you UNC Libraries, thank you Maria Estorino, but also thank you Katie Fanfani for all the organization that you did around this, Alexa Dilworth, also Ali Shea at UNC Press, and UNC Press for publishing the book. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jessica.
Jessica, Kimber, thank you so much for just your generosity and sharing such an engaging conversation with us all. This has been a great hour, and I also want to express so much appreciation to UNC Press and the Center for Documentary Studies for co-presenting this amazingly insightful program with us here at the libraries. To all of you in the audience, we're so grateful that you've spent this time with us, and don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use your 40% off discount code to buy Road Through Midnight. And please be sure to come back on September 17th at noon when we have authors Tanya Harmer and Catherine Marino in conversation with Dr. Teresa Chapa, who is the Latin American, Iberian, and Latinx Studies librarian with the University Libraries. They will discuss Harmer's book, Beatriz Allende, A Revolutionary Life in Cold War Latin America, and Marino's book, Feminism for the Americas, The Making of an International Human Rights Movement. Thank you all once again, and have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Bye.